Okay, the next part for our ukulele, we're going to be cutting and inlaying what's called an end wedge. It's going to be just a little wedge piece that we inlay on the bottom. And we also need to cut a mortise on the top where we can connect our neck. And we're going to come over to one of our bench tops with a bench vise. And I like to get a piece of carpet in here just to protect, not scratch anything up when we go to mount this. I'm going to go ahead and do the end wedge first. And I've got some jigs to use. Depending on if your ukulele body is the straight sides or the tapered sides. Mine, I remember it's the tapered sides, so I'm going to use this jig, and it says it's for the tapered sides. I have another one, same exact thing, but it's for the straight sides if you're doing that. This is going to be our little pattern for what the router bit's going to cut out. So get your ukulele body mounted in one of these bench vices here, and just be careful as you're tightening it that it doesn't smash it. You're just getting it snug enough this won't wiggle on you. And then our jig, the direction that this wedge goes, I've done some research and it looks like it doesn't really matter. However, most of them have the bigger part towards the top. So I've got my top facing this way. So I'm going to put my jig on just like this. And we need to line this up center, and we'll just clamp on our sides here to clamp it nice and firm, and then we can use our router to cut this out. I found the center on mine and put a little mark, and it's actually not right where the seam is at. It's just shifted a little bit. So it depends on how well you cut those, where it is centered or not. So don't assume that where your two boards come together is the actual center. What I did on mine is I measured across, found the middle, put a little mark, measured the center of my sound hole, put a little mark, and I just drew a straight line, lined up right where it's at. So I'm fairly close to where that seam is at, and that's all gonna get covered up when I do this end wedge. But mark the center line. If you need help with that, I can help you. Because this, when we put our little jig on here, it also has a little center line mark right on the jig, and we want to get that lined up right where our center line's at. This needs to be nice and tight down, no gaps, and then we'll take some clamps and clamp this on here. Okay, so I'm just lining this up, keeping pressure tight down, and we'll just take some of our little quick grip clamps here and just tighten this up. Again, don't smash it where it breaks it, but we want this jig on here nice and firm that it's not going to move at all. So now my jig's nice and firm and tight. Okay, the router we're going to be using, and it says it right here on my jig, it says use a 1/2 inch pattern bit. Looks like this. It's just a 1/2 inch straight patterning bit. Has that ball bearing on there that's going to follow this outline. You need to adjust the height of that bit so it's sticking out the thickness of the piece of wood that we're going to be using for our end wedge. And I've got a whole bunch, just a little strap here that's just for the ukulele end wedges. And how to adjust that height, I've already adjusted this and set it, but what I do is I set my router bit on top of my jig, and then I want to make sure that bit is sticking past the same thickness that this is, and I just place my board underneath and just check to make sure it's the same thickness sticking out on there. I just take my router, put it on the jig, put my little block of wood that I'm going to be cutting my end wedge out of next to it, and I'm just checking to see that it is sticking past my jig the exact thickness that this is. This is about an 1/8 inch thick, and so I can see my bit is sticking past that little 1/8 of an inch. And then when you go to cut this, just have that ball bearing, just follow on the inside of your jig, just don't lift up your router. You want to keep it tight down. We're going to hug the left side as we come in, hug the right side, and get all in between so we can get all that cut out. Okay, before you take it off, just make sure cut everything clean. Looks good on this one, so I'm going to go ahead and take this off. We've got our little notch ready to go. Put our little end wedge. Okay, to cut out of our strip here, that wedge, take that same pattern you used, the router, we'll just flip it upside down and just line it up somewhere on here, kind of centered. And we'll just trace the inside of this wedge. And try to get nice straight lines drawn. This wedge that you're drawing is going to be a lot longer than what we actually need. And so when we go to cut it out, we'll cut off the little overhang. I've got my little just wedge drawn here. Just go to the bandsaw and just kind of zip this off top and bottom. Carefully cut it out, leave your line, and then sand it down to your line. Now we can just wedge that right in where it fits. Again, you're leaving your line. We'll sand it right down to the line on each side. So when you cut on that bandsaw, you don't have to cut directly on your line. Cut a little bit away from your line. Okay, and then come test to see if it fits. Obviously it's a lot longer than what you need, but as you wedge it in there, put the pressure, get it pretty tight, and it actually keeps itself nice and tight in there when you press it. And we'll just go and trim off the little excess as it overhangs on each side. And you're gonna be tempted to want to draw the line on the top. It's a lot easier if you actually just come underneath here and then just draw your pen or pencil line just right where it hits, right underneath there. Same thing on the other side. Come back to that bandsaw and we're just gonna bandsaw it right where we marked our little lines. Again, leave your line so we can sand it up to the line. Okay, you just test it, make sure it fits, and it should wedge in fairly tight. And that looks great, no overhang anywhere, and it's the exact same fit, perfect fit there. Looks great. When we go to glue this, just get a little bit of glue on your little slot here. You don't want so much glue that's gonna be squeezing out everywhere, and spread that around. You even want it to go up on that side edge. Just kind of force that glue around there. And then really this is going to be super tight. You probably don't need any clamps or anything, but I do like to add a little bit of masking tape on here just to make sure it fits. Press down on it and just wedge it in there until you got the perfect fit. Wipe up a little bit of that wet glue. I'm gonna add some tape just to kind of hold it in place for that glue to dry. just press it on nice and tight. Let that dry a good 30 minutes or so. We'll do some sanding to it after. Just want that to be nice and tight, flush. We'll let that dry. We're gonna now cut our mortise in the top of our ukulele body where our neck is gonna attach. Our neck has that tenon on there, and so we're just gonna make the opposite mortise that it'll fit into. And I've mounted my body into the bench vise with some carpet holding it down, and I've marked my center line. And this was fairly close to where my two pieces came together, but it's just shifted a tiny bit to the side. But again, you just want to find the center. I just went off the center of my sound hole and again measured across and just lined it up. Mine actually worked out perfect with the top of my rosette. It was perfectly centered, and so I just lined it up right there. Find your center mark, get it mounted into a bench vise so it doesn't move around on it. Now I have this jig here, which is going to help cut our mortise. And if you're doing the ukulele, you need to have a little spacer board for this, and we'll show you how this works. But this whole jig will just fit on top. And make sure that you understand that the front of your ukulele is where the front of this hole is going to be cut. And so don't have the jig flip the other way. You want to make sure it's the front of your ukulele sticking towards you as you put this on. And this jig, you want the end of our mortise to be on the top there, so you don't want it sticking past the edge. So this part has to be pressed all the way tight forward. So this gap right here is what our little spacer is going to fit underneath there. So that'll just fit right in the very front underneath, and we'll be able to just slide this up inside to get that gap. So I've just slid this little spacer up inside here just so it can be nice and tight. I've got some wrenches that will match up with these 1/2-inch bolts, and we're going to tighten this up so it clamps itself to it. Again, making sure you're lined up centered on your little center mark, and also this jig has to be tight down on top, no gap. So just get everything placed where it's at. I've just lined it up center, and now I'm just going to tighten up our bolts here so that this whole jig will just be nice and firm right on our ukulele body. And you absolutely want to make sure this jig is not going to be moving at all on you. It's got to be real tight, and just pull on it, push on it, making sure that it doesn't move. Looking to make sure it's no gap underneath, and that the whole jig itself is not going to shift on me. You're going to use that exact same router. It's that 1/2-inch straight cutter with the pattern bit, and our depth that we're cutting in here needs to be 5/8 of an inch deep. This is that same depth that our tenon on our neck is. And so we're going to adjust the height of this bit 5/8. Now 5/8 is quite a bit to take off in one pass, and so I would actually recommend take off just a little bit at first, maybe halfway, and then we'll adjust it to that 5/8 deep for our second pass on here. So I've drawn a line on my jig where 5/8 is at, and I'm just going to get my bit adjusted. Right now it's about half of what it needs to. Later I'm going to loosen this and adjust my bit depth to be right on that 5/8 line. But don't do that on your first pass. Let's go about halfway on the first pass so we're not taking off so much. That little ball bearing will just rub on the inside of this. And again, we're just going to go the whole thing, left side, right side, lower our bit to the 5/8 line, and do the whole thing again. So that's half of what I need removed. Now I'm going to adjust my bit. I'm just looking down at my line. Loosen that little quick release and twist the router until we get that bit directly on that 5/8 line. Lock it in place and we'll get the rest of it. Again, don't lift the router up. Let that bit stop, and then make sure you're pulling it just straight out so we don't ding up my jig. And just take the wrenches and just loosen up those bolts, and we'll check to make sure that that mortise got cut correctly. Got our little mortise cut. And we'll check to see if our neck fits in there. Got that mortise here. I've got my neck and just seeing if that will fit. And, oh, we're in business. If you need to make some adjustments, come see the teacher here and we can see if we need to make any adjustments there. But this one looks like it came on pretty nice, and we'll shape that neck and get that to fit.